It's interesting. I wasn't inspired to write this book. I was asked to write it. Academie du Vin reached out to me. I had contributed chapters to some of their anthology books on California, on Burgundy, on Champagne. And they thought that I would have the right approach to create for them an intro to wine book to complement their portfolio of excellent wine books.
Welcome to the Italian Wine Podcast Book Club. Each month we select a great wine book to share. We chat to the author and get your opinions. Stay tuned as we read Between the Vines with the Italian Wine Podcast.
Hello and welcome to Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. This month our guest is Kelli White. Kelli is the Director of Education for the Wine Centre at Meadowood in Napa Valley and author of Napa Valley, Then and Now. Her latest book, Wine Confident, There Is No Wrong Way to Enjoy Wine, is published in the UK on the 1st of October and in the US on the 7th of November. Hi, Kelli. How are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good. And how's things in Napa Valley this morning?
Busy. It's red wine harvest is just getting underway for a lot of wineries around here. So traffic is terrible, but there's a lot of excitement in the air.
Great. And what about the weather?
Oh, it's been beautiful. It's been an odd year, kind of wet, cold winter. We've had an early heat this summer and then it cooled way down. So some more heat coming, which is typical for this time of year, but just sort of odd. But interesting. It'll be fun to see how that manifests in the wines.
Okay, before we talk about Wine Confident, your latest book, I'd like to explore a bit about your background and your earlier career in wine. Could you tell us what first got you into wine? I understand you had a formative experience in France. Can you tell us something about that?
My first sip, in the strictest sense, was actually probably when I went to France for the first time as a 19-year-old. I wasn't a drinker. I didn't enjoy it. It was interesting. It was more of I would say, a kind of a travel experience than a wine experience necessarily. But I, just kind of changed majors abruptly in college to the point where I wasn't, academically entrenched in either sort of world at the moment. The summer I was newly 21. So I needed some sort of summer job, but it didn't really make sense to continue to work in the neurogenetics lab that I had just left. And I wasn't yet kind of established in the art history world, which was what I was changing to pursue. And so it's a little bit driftless, and happened to walk by a wine store in Beacon Hill, Boston, with a help wanted sign in the window. And it just seemed, like the ideal college job, nights, weekends, set up for part-time, kind of a low commitment scenario. And I walked in and I very honestly said, I don't drink and I don't know anything about wine.
Excellent job application.
Exactly. So, and they were very kind to take me on, and it was a small boutique, relatively, mostly a high end, given the neighborhood. And there was a lot of emphasis on wine education and tasting. And so I went from zero. I didn't have the sort of Boone's Farm, strawberry sunset, kind of like early crescendo that many people have. It just sort of came in cold in the capacity, in a professional capacity, which I think is kind of unusual.
Yeah, and quite a transition, I guess, in terms of your educational career from science to the arts. But then also that wine shop, they must have recognized something in you that, notwithstanding your lack of experience and lack of knowledge, there must have been like an underlying passion and I think also intelligence, I suppose.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. I'm sure what they saw was just a 21-year-old golden retriever who was willing to fetch the newspaper without any complaints. But it was, and listen, the first few sips, even though that job was wonderful. And like I said, there was I was included in tastings, we hosted tastings for the community as well. I still didn't get it. It took a really long time for me to kind of get it.
Yeah.
And by get it, I mean, I academically got it. I understood the intellectual appeal before I understood the aesthetic appeal. And part of that, the reason for that was that I couldn't afford the good stuff, for a long time. And I was kind of aiming at what I thought were the right things to drink, which was namely, as I mentioned in the introduction to the book, kind of Bordeaux and Scotch. I wanted to take it seriously and I wanted to do it right. but I had no money.
Yeah.
So the Bordeaux and Scotch I could afford to taste was not compelling, or at least, what I was able to find in Boston in the early 2000s. And so I just didn't understand it, but I was drawn to, the history. I was drawn to the cultural aspects, to the language, to the lifestyle of the wine industry. But it would really take, kind of to the end of the summer of my farewell toast to the wine industry, when I was sort of accidentally exposed to a white Rhone wine that was very cuddly and very, kind of welcoming in a way that young, inexpensive Bordeaux wasn't. That a flip switched, and I'm sorry, a switch flipped, and I finally understood. And I went back to school and, sincerely pursued life and art for a while. After college, I worked at the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, but I kept one foot in the wine industry because it was so flexible. It was a relatively high pay for not having a professional degree in that field. And then eventually, my professional compass moved and pointed, away from art, away from science, and towards wine. And the nice thing about that was, it sounds completely corny and fabricated to say, but it's true that in wine, I found this wonderful intersection of my kind of two academic interests, which was science and art. And that's still, I would say, those are still two big pillars of what keeps me interested in wine to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been speaking a lot this week, or recording some podcasts with Professor Attilio Scienza, and he's one of these kind of polymath kind of figures he knows everything about science, but also the arts and literature, and the breadth of his knowledge is just incredible. But I think for him as well, those different worlds all come together in wine, and I think that's what he finds so fascinating about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the magic about wine, right? There's, first of all, just a very wonder of the taste of it, that it can taste like so many things that it doesn't contain. It's long history, its ties to agriculture, its reflection of the growing season. All of this stuff is very magical in isolation. But the intellectual depths are there, and there's so many different angles in, that it's a lifelong study. And I think there's a lot of different ways in for different people. And this is something that I try to emphasize in the educational programming that I put together, at the Wine Center where I am now, and in hopefully in some of my writing and communication, in just that it's a really big subject that touches on a lot of other things. You don't need to be obsessed with wine to sort of to really engage with the material. You can be, a history buff, or a scientist. You can be, be interested in agriculture. You can be interested in international trade. You can be interested in tax law. And there's a way to discuss wine in a way that will draw that person in. And I think that that's really wonderful.
Sure. I mean, it's also an excellent intoxicant, in case that's escaped your notice.
There's that too. And I will say this, I mean, I don't want to make too many jokes about that, but I will say, as somebody that is kind of naturally, I would say, a little high strung, finding like a little bit of a social lubricant. I'm kind of introverted and high strung, and so that social lubricant and kind of like a downshifting effect of wine has been really helpful in terms of managing my own God-given personality.
Yeah, I hear you. So let's move on back to the professional side of things. And you were a sommelier at various Michelin-starred restaurants in New York, Veritas, which I understand is now closed, and Press in St. Helena. You're my first guest that has also been a sommelier. So can you tell us a bit about how and why you became a sommelier, what that job involves, and how that experience has shaped you as a wine writer?
Yeah, I really do think that it's had a huge impact on the way that I communicate about wine in my current professional capacity. I worked as a sommelier after I'd been in the wine industry for almost a decade. So I had done retail, I had worked in distribution, I had worked in production briefly. I'd done a lot of things, and I didn't necessarily. I resisted the sommelier path mostly because I didn't want to work nights and weekends and holidays. But eventually I did make that transition and opportunity came up in New York that was too good to pass. I had started dating the man that would become my husband, who was also a sommelier, and it made sense to have, similar schedules. And it was a really wonderful experience because, I had had this, I would say, foundational experience in retail, and I love wine retail because I like consumer interface. That's always been a very rewarding thing to me. But in retail, you have the conversation, you match them with the bottle, and then you set them free. And
Yeah.
maybe they come back and you have a conversation about how that went. Ideally, if it's a great shop, if you're a good merchant, you'll actively foster that kind of feedback and those relationships. But when you're a sommelier, you're seeing it happen in real time. You're seeing
Sure.
them enjoy it in real time. And the feedback is just instantaneous and really useful. And not only from is this consumer enjoying the thing I recommended point of view, which is obviously really important, but also from am I successfully communicating about wine to this person? And I think that's how my background as a sommelier has improved my wine writing, which is not to say the wine writers that weren't sommeliers are somehow worse, but just that when you are talking to a consumer and you're looking them in the eye, you can see when the light goes out. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Rather than
Yeah.
just sort of typing in isolation and sending it out there. And, maybe you get some feedback in terms of social media responses or even direct conversations with people. But there's something about that intimate kind of real-time feedback cycle that you have as a sommelier or, in any kind of on-premise situation that I think is really meaningful if you're paying attention to it, right?
Yeah. I always think it sounds a kind of glamorous, prestigious kind of job as well. But I'm sure there's also a harder side. You're working evenings, you're in hospitality, you're serving people, and it obviously must have an effect on your kind of family life or your social life. So how do you cope with that side of things?
Oh, it's really hard. I mean, I think, first of all, I'm really not sure if this is true in Europe, but in the United States, I would say the sort of glamour of the sommelier profession is relatively new. When I
Mm.
started working as a sommelier, it was before the Somm films had come out. And so, I was, not, it wasn't, I would talk to people I went to college with or high school with or my mother's neighbors, and they would have no idea, what I did or what the significance of the sommelier position was. They thought it just worked in a restaurant. That was the part that
Yeah. Yeah.
penetrated, which is fine. And I think that hospitality is a really noble profession, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But the extra kind of glamour layer, I think, came later. And it was an interesting transition to live through, where all of a sudden it went from no one outside the wine industry had any idea what I did for a living to suddenly everyone assumed I was a master sommelier, and thought I had the coolest job and this, that, and the other thing. That happened later, and I think we're still living in that kind of moment. But that was definitely a funky thing to live through. Quite frankly, I was kind of glad that I was able to start in the position when it had a bit more obscurity. Again, at least in the United States, because I got to sort of make my mistakes, do my fumbles, without the big spotlight, and then.
Yeah.
But it's a difficult lifestyle for sure. I think, nights, weekends, for a lot of my sommelier career, I didn't have health insurance or 401k, or, these are things that have come hopefully into the restaurant space, at least the United States, again, in recent history, but wasn't necessarily something that I was able to take advantage of. And so that's, you have the kind of early access to maybe good amounts of cash and a hypothetically flexible schedule relatively young. But the restaurant industry, at least when I was in it, wasn't necessarily setting people up for sort of a comfortable life later on. And
Yeah.
so when I started in New York City at Veritas, I came out to Napa Valley and was working at Press. And then eventually, when I felt like I could support myself as a writer, I wanted to leave the floor, as we call it. I wanted to leave the floor and have more normal hours, and maybe even have weekends off and see my family on holidays and do that thing. And now that I'm a mother, I don't know how it would be possible to work, in restaurants as a parent. I know a lot of people do it, and I'm really in awe of their ability.
Mm.
I think it must be incredibly challenging. But it's certainly something, it's certainly, I think, tough.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned there about your transition from being a sommelier to being a wine writer. You're senior staff writer at Guild Somm, where you wrote articles and expert guides on a wide range of topics, and also received various awards for your wine writing. So you obviously took to that very naturally as well. You mentioned there the pressures of family life and scheduling and the demands of hospitality. Is that really what inspired you to transition from hospitality to wine writing and education?
The reality is, I think I always would have worked as a wine writer if I had felt I could support myself doing so. But I didn't feel that way for a very long time. And so, I was passionate about writing and the written word long before I ever even knew what Merlot was. Right. And so, and I love that. I wrote, poetry and fiction and worked on the literary magazine and things like that. Like, I was never necessarily something that was my career path early on. I was investigating these other things, but I always liked that, and I always had some aptitude for it. So when I was working as a sommelier, even back in New York City days, I was writing articles. And originally I was writing for free, and I wrote for free, for quite some time. And I still remember the first time I got a paid writing gig, which was back when what's now the Somm Journal was called the Sommelier Journal. They asked me, they hired me to write an article, and then they said, what's your rate? And I thought, what's my rate? I have no idea. What's my rate? Oh my God. And, made 1,000 phone calls, what should I charge? And I think they paid me back then, this is probably 2008, $1.25 a word. And I would say the price rate per word has just gone downhill since then. So I've, was writing articles sporadically as a kind of a passion side project while I was working on the floor. And I did that out of interest. I wanted to do that. I wrote my book while I was working on the floor. So I would, wake up in the morning and I would work on the book, the Napa book. And then I would go to work, and then I would come home. And if I still had any steam left in me, I would write a little more. I would do it on the weekends, etc. It took me 5 years, in part because I was writing it with these scraps of my time. When the book came out, it was right around the time I left the floor, because I actually went to work for Venice for a couple of years. So Antonio Galloni just started Venice and was hired, putting together, a small staff back then. So I worked for him for 2 years, and that was the first time I had gotten, a salary to be a writer. I did a lot of other things. I would say I did more other things, more support things than writing per se in that role. But nonetheless, like, that was pretty exciting to get, pay and benefits and things to work for a publication. I think there's not a lot of full-time jobs like that. And so the Guild Somm opportunity came, on the heels of that. I did that for a number of years, and that was exciting because I was able to, flex my more academic muscles, I would say, and write in more of a scholarly and research-driven tone, which I really enjoy. And I think am good at making some of the complexities of wine easy to understand. And then I got the opportunity to be where I am today, which is, at the Wine Center, where it's an educational position. And so, at Guild Somm, I was writing, but I was also teaching, and I enjoyed that as well. And I've been actually teaching about wine since I was 23. It's another thing I enjoyed. So now I've kind of, as far as full-time work goes, transitioned away from writing again, and now I'm focused on education.
Very interesting. I mean, you have to build up your expertise, don't you, before you write a book about something. It can take 5 or 10 years, whether you're writing about football or politics. You have to have done the groundwork, and I guess yours was very much on the floor, as you mentioned. But you mentioned also your first book, Napa Valley, then and now, that was originally released in 2015. And this takes a really in-depth look at the history, landscape, wineries and wines of the Napa Valley, with a particular emphasis on the older vintages. I think I counted them all correctly, 1,242 pages long. So it is the definitive guide to one of the world's most celebrated wine regions, but it's also beautifully presented and illustrated. One review I read in preparing for this conversation described it this way: the pages are glossy, the design simply organised, and the pictures quietly captivating. I thought that was a good summary of what you've achieved with that incredible book.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book for sure. My husband actually took the photographs. He did a great job. I had a wonderful book designer by the name of Michael Vanderbijl, and the book actually won a graphic design award, a Graphice award. So yeah, it's certainly a beautiful work, and I'm very proud of it.
And I love that description of it being quietly captivating. A beautiful way to describe a book, or a person for that matter.
Indeed.
So yeah, you grew up in Massachusetts and New York. I read that you were a self-proclaimed former old world wine snob. What drew you to Napa Valley, and did you appreciate what you had undertaken when you began writing that book?
It was a complex moment in time. My now husband had opened a wine bar in the Time Warner Center of New York the week the market crashed in August of 2008, and that was a tough time to be in the luxury good business in New York City. There were the 1% riots. There was a lot of unrest, and then there was also a real immediate curbing of spending on luxury goods, and so a lot of restaurants closed, a lot of wine lists shrank appreciably. A lot of sommeliers started to leave the city. I remember Hong Kong was kind of beckoning a lot of the most talented sommeliers at that time. And so it just was sort of like, okay, what are we doing here? And now looking back, obviously New York rebounded, the wine industry rebounded, fine dining rebounded, of course. But in that moment, it wasn't clear that the future was going to be so rosy.
Yeah, you wouldn't have known that. Yeah.
So we started to talk about what's next. And my husband was said he'd always wanted to learn how to make wine, and so we started to look around for wine regions, but not just like any old wine regions with enough white tablecloths that we could get jobs as sommeliers to support ourselves through this, through potentially a career transition. And so we got connected to Leslie Rudd, who owned Press Restaurant, who agreed to let us share the wine directorship, kind of each work part-time at Press, which would allow us to pursue these other interests. And so I was really nervous about it because at Veritas, at that time, it was one of the largest wine lists in the world, and it was really dedicated to old world wines. I had worked for a distributor of Italian wines. And prior to that, I'd worked for a distributor of Burgundy, and I'd worked Harvest in Burgundy. And then in Boston, my wine shop had a lot of European wines. So I didn't have the experience and, quite frankly, the interest in California or New World wines at all. I was really focused on Europe. And so there was just, so I was nervous moving out to California to take over and cultivate what the owner was very insistent on being an all Napa wine list. And I thought, I'm going to go there and I'm going to be immediately exposed as being completely ignorant. And so I wanted to, kind of buy the all powerful guide to Napa Valley, and I didn't find it. And I had been writing articles, at that time rather regularly. And I thought, kind of naively, I sort of said out loud in the moving van on the way across country, like, what if I wrote that book? Maybe somebody's working on it right now, or maybe they're not. And what if they're not? And what if it was me? And so I had this idea in my head that perhaps I could write about it. What I didn't yet have an appreciation for that would come over time was of the incredible wealth that was the old Napa Valley, but also old California wines in particular, because I had inherited and perpetuated the stereotype that, Napa wines were what you drank while you waited for your Bordeaux to age. And I think that idea is still out there. Hopefully I've done some good work in trying to convince people to the alternative. But, back then, this is 2010, by the time we finally moved out west, those older Napa wines were people couldn't give them away. There was no market for those wines. And so it was this really wonderful opportunity to kind of have a low risk exploration of these older vintages. And even though Scott and I were more confident in them than, say, the owner of the restaurant or like the local community, even we were really trepidatious. And it was just after opening great bottle upon great bottle upon great bottle, we realized, wow, these wines are really special and nobody's writing about them. And so that became, a sort of secondary focus of the book, and I would say an element of differentiation.
And am I right in thinking that you published the book independently, Kelli?
Yeah, it was self-published. Which, was great, which was very exciting and exhausting. And I'm not sure I would do it again. If I did it again, it would have to be done very differently. But yeah, I did it. I self-published it with a loan from Leslie Rudd that, he was very kind to give me a 0% interest loan to publish that book, but it was very expensive to publish. So I did pay it all back. So I'm proud of that. But yeah, I self-published because prior to really marching forward with the book, I ended up going back to Burgundy and staying with the Wasserman family. And, they sort of have had this wonderful circle of writers around them. They were really supportive. There were always writers, staying on property. And when I was there, they had two. And it was Alan Meadows and Clive Coates. And so I got to spend a considerable amount of time with both of them. And Alan had just got the proof copy of Pearl of the Coat, which he self-published. And was really excited about. And, he was examining it and going through for mistakes. And I was able to peer over his shoulder. And Clive Coates was there. And, he had some war stories about dealing with publishers, about, them not being able to control the title of the book or the photos or having the concept changed or, this, that, and the other thing. And Alan was very bullish about self-publishing. And he was kind enough to give me his business model, or rather his business plan. And so I kind of took like an indexer costs roughly this, a project manager costs roughly this, photography costs roughly this, printing costs roughly this. And so I was able to take that, scale it to my own project. And that's what I, presented Leslie Rudd. And I thought, there's no reason. The reason not to self-publish is that it's very cost intensive up front. The benefits are that if you do it right, you can keep more of the money on the back end. The Napa book was effectively a break-even proposition, so nobody really made any money, but at least it covered itself. But yeah, it wouldn't have been possible without the loan from Leslie, at least that book being so big and relatively expensive. That's the sort of reason why we did it. But then, of course, it's not necessarily just about controlling the product, which is nice, but you also need to manage the logistics, the fulfillment, the sales and marketing. It's a big job, and it took me 5 years to write it, and it took me 5 years to sell the first run through and pay back the loan. So it's a 10-year chunk of my life. So I'm very proud of that, but that's a level of, now I'm in my mid 40s. Like I don't have that kind of energy to give anymore.
Yeah. I mean, it's an incredible piece of work.
Oh,
the fact that it was self-published as well just makes it all the more remarkable, I think. For those of us who are not familiar with the region, particularly, I've never been. What is it about Napa Valley that makes it so special as a wine region, but also just as a place for you and your family to live?
Well, I mean, I think as a wine region, it's exciting on a lot of levels. It's a small, really physically dynamic, special place. There's a lot because of the complexities of the soil and of the terrain and of the microclimate. There's a lot that's possible here. I think probably more than a lot of people realize. There's also both this kind of benefit of history. The wine industry, really got kind of rocking and rolling in the 1880s, even earlier, but really got going in the 1880s. So there's a lot of history, but because there was this sort of long slumber inspired by Prohibition, there's a lot of new energy too. So it's this interesting combination, an interesting dynamic that I think is to the region's benefit. There's also, I would say, overall a very high attention to detail, a high commitment to quality. And like I said, it's a small place, so it's a small community. And living here, it really does feel like a community. And that's something that's been reinforced by living here through multiple natural disasters, including, pretty major earthquake and 2 big rounds of fires, and seeing how the community pulled together and supported one another was really very powerful and reaffirming. As just as a place in the wine industry, I had this odd idea as, driving west from New York City, that's kind of driving off the map of wine relevance because, to go to Napa Valley, but it's oddly a little bit of a hub in terms of, an intellectual hub, an industry hub for the wine industry at large, because so many important businesses have headquarters here, not just like the Wine Spectator, also, Wilson Daniels, there's Cork producers have outposts here, Coopers have outposts here. There's a handful of really prominent wine writers that either live here full time or have homes here and spend a lot of time here. A lot of the people that I would see in New York and think, oh my God, they're a hero of mine. It's so great. They're here too. And so it felt that was a surprise to learn, but it's a place, it's a high concentration. There's a lot of brain power here. And I think that also makes it really special.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds a truly fascinating place, and one that's definitely on my long list of wine regions to visit.
You've got to come. Let's make this happen.
For sure. Let's turn to your subsequent book, your book that is coming out in the autumn, Wine Confident. There is no wrong way to enjoy wine. And let's take a reading from that book, Kelli. You're going to read, I think, from the first chapter, Why Wine Matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay. So in the beginning of the book, there's a series of small sections, and one of them is called Why Wine Matters and How It Can Improve Your Life. For many, wine is simply an alcoholic beverage interchangeable with cocktails, beer, or even hard seltzer, the thing you drink when the bride and groom didn't shell out for the open bar. And yet some people dedicate their lives to its study. An enthusiast might spend hours extolling the complexity of a fine Burgundy's bouquet. Collectors will dedicate vast sums of money and equally large chunks of time chasing the rarest gems. And piles upon piles of books have been written on the subject. Pocket guides, pairing guides, regional deep dives, encyclopedias, atlases, textbooks, even memoirs. And that's not to mention all the online resources, articles, podcasts, videos, films, TV shows, and festival after festival after festival. You can study its manufacture in college, spend your adult life at tasting courses, chase accreditations, the reputational equivalents of PhDs, sort of. Or join the ranks of the thousands of people laboring to grow, make, sell, buy, import, export, pour, pair, or flip the stuff. Beer and spirits enjoy some of the above, but to quote Elaine Chukon-Brown in a 2023 or any global podcast, wine is different because people fall in love with wine. Wine has a romance to it. Now, I have met some very passionate gin enthusiasts, but I've yet to read a poem dedicated to juniper. That love Brown references is both powerful and transferable. By association, it can make people fall in love with places, as evidenced by the popularity of wine tourism, with the growing season, and with agriculture. In this particular podcast, Brown was discussing wine's unique position to stoke consumer concern about the environment in a way that few comestible goods can. Because of the emotional response it can inspire, wine has the same potential to get people to care about the treatment of farm workers or international immigration policies. Wine can do that. Yogurt cannot.
I love that line, that simple explanation that the reason why wine is different to yogurt. It's so simple, but it's such an effective way of explaining why wine is different to more or less anything else. And even as you mentioned, gin and tonic, I was trying to think of a poem or something that rhymed with gin and tonic. I remember there was a song from Oasis. I don't know if you've been following at the moment. Oasis have just announced, this is the English band, they've just announced a reunion, and they had a song called Supersonic, which was a rhyming slang for gin and tonic. And that's about as close as I can come to a poem that involves gin. But you're right, of course, wine has this romance that most other things that we consume perhaps don't. The book is also quite different, I think, in style and tone to Napa Valley. Kelli, is that something that you were conscious of when you were writing it? And what was it really that inspired you to write this book?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I wrote that section and then I sent it around to some early readers, including a friend of mine who's a novelist. And he actually responded by sending me a poem about gin, which I had not been aware of. So it's not, we've already got a fact checking issue in the book, but it's a poem by Seamus Heaney called Sloe Gin. Are you familiar with this? The
I'm not
clear
anything
weather of
about them.
juniper darkened into winter, on and on. It's so it does it does exist, but as far as I can tell, that's the only one. But
Right.
answering your story, it's interesting. I wasn't inspired to write this book. I was asked to write it.
Right.
Academie du Vin reached out to me. I had contributed chapters to some of their anthology books on California, on Burgundy, on Champagne, and they thought that I would have the right approach to create for them an intro to wine book to complement their portfolio of excellent wine books. And I remember thinking, I got the email, and obviously it's unbelievably exciting to be asked to write a book. That's certainly nothing I ever thought would happen. But my original, feeling was like, well, I don't want to write an intro to wine book. I'm kind of, I'm an academic wine writer. I'm a specialist. But the more I thought about it and the more I got into it, the more I just felt more and more excited and committed to the project, because I have spent so much, unlike I think potentially a lot of other wine writers, I've spent so much time on the consumer front lines, talking to consumers, matching them with wines, talking about, seeing how successful that was, looking people in the eye while I communicate to them. And I've heard so many questions. And it's interesting because, when I first started teaching about wine, working in retail in Massachusetts, I was teaching at a university, professors, their spouses. It was, obviously not students because of the drinking age in the United States. But that was one population. And at Guildsom, I was teaching young sommeliers in the trade. And then now I'm teaching tourists and visitors that come to Napa Valley. And it's all these different groups. And then I, at the restaurant, I obviously encountered a big span of people as well. And I found that no matter the demographic, a lot of the questions are the same. People have some really universal, fundamental anxieties about wine, and I do mean anxieties, and that is one of the nails I try to hammer on a lot with this book. Was like, everybody relax. It's kind of the thing. I think the wine industry does itself a lot of disservice by kind of overcomplicating things at every turn. That doesn't mean it's not complex. There's a difference between complex and complicated.
Yeah.
And I think I've seen people, kind of their shoulders tense up. They're so afraid to say the wrong thing, to like the wrong thing, right? To do the wrong thing. There's all this, I think, unnecessary anxiety about wine pairings and glassware and all this stuff. And when really these are, for the most part, relatively low risk scenarios. And I'm not trying to trivialize the concern. I do understand them. I think that there's I think it's unfortunate. There's a lot of kind of class anxiety, right? You don't want to, there's a lot of, you might think it reflects on your level of sophistication or education or knowledge. It's complex to kind of fall short on your wine knowledge, and so I understand why there's all this emotion. But I would like to, my position is that wine is here to the benefit of your life, right? It shouldn't be a source of anxiety. It can be a source of inspiration, and hopefully you feel excited to learn more. But that's different than feeling embarrassed at the things that you don't know. And so I try not to get too self-helpy, but I try to be as encouraging, where I can, and tried to strike a balance that was hopefully successful between giving people information and explaining why things are in a way that's easy to understand without overly simplifying things and becoming, kind of condescending, while also saying like, okay, some of this stuff we worry about too much. Here's what you don't really need to worry about. And here's what you should pay more attention to. And that was, I thought, a really compelling exercise to go through just intellectually on my own, to just kind of canvas the world of wine and say, okay, what are people freaked out about that they could really relax over? And what are the things here that people are overlooking that might really enhance their, their wine appreciation or their experience drinking particular bottles. So that's one of the main
Yeah,
thrusts of the book.
yeah, very interesting. And I mean, these are themes that are also important to us here at the Italian Wine Podcast. And in fact, we published a book back in 2022 called Wine Democracy. And that was a little plug, by the way, in case you missed it. But that book was basically about trying to tackle some of these issues around accessibility and about the way we talk about wine, the language we use, and that so-called Western bias. So yeah, there's some definite overlap there between the issues that you were grappling with, if that's the correct word to use, and what we're trying to do here as well at the Italian Wine Podcast. So I'm now going to come at you with some of these questions, these recurring questions, probably that people ask you all the time in your life as a sommelier or a wine educator or wine writer.
Sure.
One of my big problems is basically a lack of or a completely underdeveloped sense of smell. So what practical advice would you give to someone like me in terms of training your nose?
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, smelling wine and picking out individual scents is really hard, right? Wine is abstract. It's complex. It's aromatically incredibly complex. And you're also limited by your existing smell vocabulary. And this is where things like, Western bias come into play, right? Because not everybody around the world has been exposed to the same foodstuffs. And we're often, not always, but we're often describing wine, especially young wines, in terms of fruits and flowers and things. And these, quote unquote ingredients can be really culturally specific. So I don't want to say this is always the most useful way to describe wine, but nonetheless, if that's something you want to train for, I would say the best thing that you can do is to smell non-wine. Don't just sit there with wine glass after wine glass, beating yourself over the head saying, like, where are the blueberries?
Yeah.
Like, go and, try to become a more sensitive and active smeller. Now, there's a downside to that. Not everything in the world smells great, but I would say try to, smell different parts of different fruits. One of the examples that I give in the book is that, when I was first learning about wine and somebody said, tomato stem or something, I rolled my eyes because I thought that sounded just so precious and pretentious. But then I actually started growing my own tomatoes and I smelled the difference between the fruit and the leaves. And I smelled the difference between a freshly picked sun-warmed tomato and one that had been, kind of purchased under ripe from the grocery store and allowed to ripen on the counter at home. And, there really are these differences, and learning them and paying attention to that, I think is just a wonderful skill, even if you never apply it to wine, being sort of more present in your body, being more present in your space. I think, to understand and to study these things, you need to put down your phone, you need to focus. It's just, these are good exercises to do, no matter smelling the difference between different types of flowers, but just trying to increase your smell sensitivity outside of a wine context before turning your gaze to wine, I think would be really helpful.
Okay, great. And then when you're tasting wine, I mean, my habit would be I would tend to open a bottle of wine at a time, and which is fine, but then you kind of really only getting the smell on that first taste. Is it better, do you think, to have perhaps 2 or 3 different bottles of wine open where you can then compare and contrast maybe similar styles or different styles, different grape varieties? What's your thoughts on that? I mean, from a practical perspective, it just makes more sense to open one bottle at a time. But I guess from a learning perspective, that might not always be the best approach.
Yeah, I think especially for people that are just starting out, the most important thing is to understand context, to sort of kind of calibrate your palate to, okay, let's say we're going to use agreed upon Western terms to describe wine. Let's talk about wine's palate weight. We'll talk about acidity. We'll talk about levels of tannins. We'll talk about, kind of aromatic intensity and range. So let's say we're trying to speak inside these parameters. You need to understand the 2 extremes of all those categories to know whether the one wine you're tasting is kind of, loud or quiet, or, medium in length or long in length, or high in tannin or low in tannin, until you build that context and until you calibrate your palate to understand the range that's out there. It's going to make it hard to really position the wine in front of you accurately, in this universe. At least at first, the best way to build context is to compare at least, two wines to each other. Because again, tasting one in isolation, you can it'd be hard to really figure out what's going on. But if you have something to compare it against, you can say, okay, this one is lighter in body. This one's richer. This one feels, lower in alcohol. This one's higher in alcohol. And that you can look at the label and verify, with the relative degree of accuracy. So that becomes expensive, and that becomes logistically difficult. And so, there's not a lot of great solutions to that. I think that one of the easiest is probably to try multiple wines by the glass in a restaurant. That's probably relatively easy and cost effective. Another thing that you can do is, attend tastings. A lot of times if there's, I'm much more familiar with, the American wine industry. So this may not be relevant in other places, though I suspect it is in some. A lot of retailers will host, tastings, right? They'll have a range of wines open on, I don't know, Friday afternoon or something, and you can pop in and do that there. If you wanted to do it at home, you can either form a little tasting group, right? Even just one other person, cut your expenses in half. Or you can invest in something like a Coravin, which can be really helpful. It's not an inexpensive gadget, but it is very useful if you really do want to, just you at home, no tasting group, want to compare multiple bottles of wine to each other without feeling either like you have to drink more than you want to and or wasting the wines, because it does extend their life considerably. So those would be, I would say, the more practical ways to go about it.
Yeah, great. Some great practical advice there. Another anxiety of mine, the common anxiety, I suppose, is ordering wine, which can often be quite intimidating. I usually stick with what I know, or if I don't know anything on the list, then opt for the second cheapest on the list. So what's your advice on interacting with sommeliers and ordering wine with confidence? And let's be realistic, most of us are on a budget as well. When I look at a wine list, sometimes in Verona, at the bottom end of the list, you can see bottles at 250, 350, 600 euros a bottle. But for most of us, that's not really a practical possibility.
Well, I would say my first word of advice would be to use your sommelier and to not be afraid or intimidated by them. I had a client recently who was a doctor. This was like a professionally, professional, successful woman. And she said she was afraid to ask sommeliers for advice because she didn't want them to think that she didn't know anything about wine. And I know I'm not trying to make fun of her. I just was really blown away by that, because I thought that would be like me not asking you for medical advice because I didn't want you to think I didn't know enough about the human body. Like, a sommelier is there to guide you and answer questions. They work for you. So, certainly, first of all, don't be afraid to engage help. The other thing that I would say is you really need to be as direct as possible, because I'll say this, as somebody who's been on the other side of that conversation, it's hard to guess what you want. And I have, especially when it comes to price, I've offended people in both ways. I've offended people by suggesting a wine that was more than they were prepared to spend. And I've offended people by suggesting a wine that was less than they were used to spending. And so, if you don't provide any guidance in terms of price, all the sommelier can do is guess. And, maybe they're going to look at, your outfit or your whatever, and make some snap judgments on, sort of what your general income level is. But that's a kind of a tough, I was never great at that. So I would say just be really direct. And if your budget is $75 or 75 euros, you don't even have to say it out loud. If you don't want to talk about, money in front of your company, you can just use your finger and point to the number on the wine list and say, I'd like to be around here, or I would like to be here or under, or this is my absolute maximum. Then that is so helpful. That's the single most useful thing you can do. And then the other thing, that's the harder thing, is trying to communicate about your tastes and the things that you like. Because talking about
Yeah.
wine, unless it's somebody that you taste with all the time and you know you have the same frame of reference and your palates are calibrated the same, is really tough. And so I give a couple of stories in my book about where, as a sommelier, I really misinterpreted what people were trying to tell me. Um, and because, you might ask for something chocolatey or bold or smooth and
Mhm.
or Bordeaux like, and I might have just a completely different interpretation of those words, right? Because they're not scientifically calibrated. And so I've found, as a sommelier, the best way for me to zero in on something that somebody likes is to not use descriptor words, right? Which are open to interpretation. You have to come from the same
Mhm.
cultural background, but to instead use specific examples of other wines that you like. So,
Okay.
and I, by the time I got off the floor, it was becoming common where people would just open their phone and show me a picture of the last bottle they liked. They didn't even have to remember it anymore because they took a picture. And so if you show me a picture or you tell me, like, I really like, this particular Sancerre, but we are, on a Napa Valley only context, like, that gives me some information in order to better understand your palate. And we don't have to play a kind of a linguistic guessing game. So I'd say
Yeah.
point to the price, and then rather than trying to get creative with your wine descriptions, you can tell them specifically the last bottle of wine that you enjoyed, and that's going to give a smart sommelier a lot of information.
Okay, great. I'm gonna give that a go now, Kelly. With you, I'm gonna tell you, I love Beaujolais, and my
Okay.
budget is €15 now. Don't judge me, but what would you recommend?
No, so if you came into my restaurant at Press, right, where
Okay.
not my restaurant, but the restaurant where I most recently worked, and which was a Napa only wine list, and you told me that you had a €15 budget and you liked Beaujolais, that at least tells me that you're probably not in the market for, a Napa Cabernet, right? You're not going to want a lot of extraction, a lot of tannin. You're probably looking for something with a higher acidity, with lower alcohol, fresher, brighter fruits. So, Pinot Noir would be an obvious choice, but I might, try to sell you a fun Charbonneau, and get you excited about something a bit different.
Yeah,
So there's
I'll take
there
it. I'll take it.
there you go. It's just so much more helpful than if you tried to describe your ideal Beaujolais, and then I'm like, okay, I have no,
Yeah.
it's too
Okay,
difficult.
no, great. That's good advice. I remember that next time I'm ordering wine. Time is marching on, so let's come down to your second readings, if that's okay, Kelly.
Of course. So the second part of the the entry that I just read goes like this. Wine plays a fundamental role in many religious ceremonies. Artists across years and mediums have used it famously for creative fuel, but it has more intimate effects like bringing a family or a group of friends together over a shared meal, or toasting one of life's milestones, such as the birth of a child, the purchase of a house, the union of a marriage. Learning to slow down and appreciate a glass of wine might help you slow down and appreciate life in general. It certainly did for me. Wine can also make the medicine of a difficult conversation easier to swallow. I have a close friend who reconnected with his estranged father over wine. Their shared interest gave him an excuse to reach out after a long silence and something to talk about while working up to the painful parts. And I've been to more than one funeral where a small group went out afterwards to swap stories over a bottle or two. A good wine can relax your shoulders after a difficult day at work, enhance your meal, or make potty training a bit more bearable. A great wine can elevate your spirit and connect you to a higher aesthetic realm. Both will get you blissfully buzzed. I would also submit that there's no easier or better gift to give than a bottle of wine. Because taste in wine is so personal, giving someone a bottle of wine you are passionate about is like giving them a little piece of yourself. And though some of us can take down 750 milliliters without assistance, the standard bottle of wine is sized to be shared. By gifting wine, you are inviting the recipient to connect with another person. And what could be more meaningful than
Lovely, very good. From potty training to hearing the gift of wine.
that? I speak from experience.
Yeah, I don't think I ever tried wine during potty training. Maybe after.
Yeah, it's more for the trainer than the trainee.
Sure. Okay. Let's move on to talk about the wine that you're producing with your husband, I think, Kelly, if that's right, the Houndstooth label. Can you tell us something about that project?
Sure. So that's really the project that brought us to California. And my husband and I founded that in 2011, and we make small, like small batches of wine that kind of straddle the nerdy and classic. So Pinot Noir, Chardonnay at first, and then this ties into your theme here, which and then eventually some Barbera. And this year, I think he's making some Carignan potentially. So we started it together, and then I was never under the expectation that my writing career would take off. And when it did, I kind of stepped away from the brand Houndstooth. I'm still a founder. I'm still one of the owners, but it's very much my husband's thing, which is nice because making wine is really hard, and I get to just kind of armchair it in and enjoy the fruits of his labor.
Is that available to buy? Is that distributed? Would I find that on wine lists?
It's kind of still an insider secret. I mean, he's only making, maybe 100 cases a year. So it's really tiny. And so, he has a small amount of distribution and exposure. It's exported to Belgium. And there was a wine list in Sweden that had it for a minute. But for the most part, it's something that is more of a friends and family kind of a project.
Okay. And what about your relationship with Italian wine? This is the Italian Wine Podcast.
Indeed.
So I'm curious to know which styles and which wine regions are of most interest to you.
Well, my relationship with Italian wine is fraught because I'm both extraordinarily intimidated by it and also profoundly attracted to it. So it's this it's definitely something that's really important to both mine and my husband's drinking lives. I don't know if this happened to you, but if you're at a tasting or if you're ever leading a tasting or at a tasting, you can always tell the wine somebody liked the best, even if they aren't prepared to answer that question, by which wine glass is empty first. And that's kind of how I measure my interest in Italian wine. My husband and I have a pretty robust wine collection, and we've wines from all over the world, and he makes wines. And the thing that we cannot keep in the house is Italian wine. As soon as it's there, we drink it. So I think that says a lot about our relationship with Italian wine. In fact, just last night, I drank a wonderful bottle of Frisia, which would be perfect for your budget and your palate. And that was gorgeous. But we're both very obsessed with Sangiovese, but that's just the gateway drug.
Yeah.
I don't need to tell you. There's just a lot to discover there. So I know that's kind of a non-answer, but it feels like such a big topic. I mean, I don't quite know what to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's one of the, as you say, the attractions, but also the perils of Italian wine. It's just so varied and complex and diverse. I think you really have to just kind of try and find your own little niche, whether it's a grape or a region or variety, and start from there.
Well, it's a lot. I mean, it feels probably an endless journey, right? I have a colleague with me for the last 4 years, Sarah Bray, who has forgotten more about Italian wine than I could ever know. And she, over the course of 4 years, introduced me to so many different wonderful wines. And, as much as I really, revel, and by the nature of my clientele now, deal mostly with higher end wine. And so, Tuscan wine, wines from Piedmont, etc. So many of the things that I've been exposed to through her and other people have been really budget friendly and really just exciting, flavors that you don't experience in the sort of more ubiquitous French varieties that have spread around the world. And so, so that part is really exciting. As somebody that drinks, a lot of wine, you want to control, what you spend on a given wine, and Italy in general has been incredibly friendly.
Okay, let's take your third reading, Kelli. It's from Wine as Lifelong Study.
Sure, Wine as Lifelong Study. Every year, the entire world of wine is born again. This is hardly new commentary, and yet it's worth restating. Not only is there a novel vintage each year, but new wineries open while others close. Virgin ground is planted, and old blocks are torn up. Even the vines that stay untouched in the ground turn 1 year older, which subtly affects their performance. Wines in bottle age too, perhaps less subtly. The climate changes. The market changes. Prices fluctuate, as do liquor laws. The wine world expands. Poland, Alaska. The wine world contracts. Corporate consolidation. We talk about wine being a natural product, but it is also a fundamentally human one, which further complicates the picture. Properties change hands, technology improves things or moves us backwards, abandoned traditions are reclaimed. Winemakers die, with or without their secrets. Writers, influencers, and tastemakers retire or are launched. A new generation comes into wealth. We consumers do not stand still either. Our palates mature, our fortunes shift, our health falters. All of this adds to the dynamics of wine, making it a lifelong study. It is wonderfully impossible to know everything about wine, and anyone who claims to should be regarded with profound suspicion. I say this not to overwhelm you with all there is to learn, but to free you from feeling as if you must learn it all. You can't, so don't try. Find what interests you and take it as far as you want to go. Don't worry about the rest. You do not need to be an expert in all wine to appreciate a given wine. You only need to be curious. Drink, read, keep an open mind. Don't let anyone shame you about your tastes or the holes in your knowledge, and stay thirsty. That's pretty much all the wine advice worth giving, but please do keep reading the rest of this book.
Yes, that's very good advice, I think, for all our listeners there. Great advice from Wine Confident by Kelli White. Thanks.
Thank you.
Tell us something about your writing habits, Kelli. How do you get in the mood to write? When do you write? You've got so many other commitments and obviously a busy family life as well. What advice would you give to aspiring wine writers?
Well, that's tough. I mean, you really kind of have to find your own rhythm, right? And because my own rhythm has changed based on the realities of my life changing, right? So, I remember, I might be misquoting, but Karen McNeil, who wrote the foreword to the book and lives in Napa Valley and has been, a guiding influence on me for a long time, and I admire her greatly. I may be misremembering, but I believe that she, wakes up every morning and writes for several hours and just writes. Some of it's good, some of it's not, but she just has that discipline. When I was writing full time, I was not like that. I was much more, kind of an inspirational writer. So if I was going for a walk or I was in the shower, or I was driving. I remember one time driving and coming up with the perfect sentence for something I was working on and pulling over and sitting there for 45 minutes and working on this before getting back on the road because I wanted to seize that sort of moment. There were still days where I needed to write. And so I would just write and, throw away 90% of it, but that 10% would end up being really important. But generally speaking, I would write when it flowed. And if it wasn't flowing, I wasn't necessarily always forcing it unless I was really under duress. I would use that time to do the other things that, writers need to do. Research, right? Conduct interviews, send out emails, send out invoices, chase payment, kind of update your software. There's all sorts of things that you need to do. It's not just, clacking on a keyboard all the time. And so I knew myself and my brain well enough that I said, okay, it's just not flowing today. I'm going to wait for inspiration and I'm going to do this other stuff now because I have this time that I've set aside and I need to do these things. And then I'll wait and seize those moments. Well, that worked great, back when I didn't have a child and when I didn't have a job. I have a very demanding, full-time job, and I work Tuesday through Saturday, and my daughter's in school Monday through Friday. So Sunday's our family day. It's very important to us. And then Monday, when she's at school and I'm not at work, that was when I wrote Wine Confident. So for this time, for this book, I think it probably took 6 months. I had 1 day a week to work on this. And so because of that, I couldn't play those games with myself. We're like, oh, you don't feel like writing today? Like, that's okay. You can, defrag your hard drive, whatever. There was no time for that. So this time around, I had to be much more strict. And so that was an interesting transition. And quite frankly, I found it really hard. But the way that I write is through constant revision. So even if I wrote a sort of uninspired outline of a section, I probably, even pieces I like, I'm going back and I'm editing and I'm changing sentences, I'm changing words, I'm changing orders. I'm probably going back 10, 15, 20 times to anything that I've written. And I think it probably drove my editor, the wonderfully patient Susan Keeble, insane, because I was feeding her pieces of this as it would finish. And inevitably I'd be like, so, that thing I just sent you, here's a newer version. And I would constantly do that. So, so the poor thing probably is very happy to have this in the books and done.
Yeah, that's very interesting how you I mean, your writing habits just have to adapt to the context in which you're writing, I suppose, and the circumstances in which you're writing. I mean, I know my own personal experience, that's the case. I just try to squeeze in an hour here and there wherever I can. The idea of having a full day dedicated to writing, or even a full morning, would be a luxury at the moment, I think, because you have to do other things. You have to interview, or you have to read as well. Reading is so important to writing, and not just reading about the topic that you're writing about.
Yeah, exactly. You have to stay inspired. I mean, they say the best writers are readers, right? I think that's really important. And I also feel that on the converse side, what I'm doing, for a living right now, is the best teachers are students, I think.
Yeah, that's a very good point as well. Being an educator is also a great way into writing about a subject, because if you can't teach a subject, then it's kind of difficult to know how you begin to then write about it.
Exactly.
Anyway, what are you reading for pleasure then? We've kind of broached that subject. What's on your bedside table at the moment?
Well, I will say, I'm very very lucky in that I was a couple years ago invited to join this very serious women's book club here in Napa Valley, that with some really impressive women in it, and so we have a curriculum each year. And last year we were reading works by lesser known female authors, and this coming year we're going to be reading banned books, which is very exciting. So I do a lot of wine reading, of course, but I think it's really important to read other types of things, other types of nonfiction, of course, but also fiction. I think just great writing of any kind of flavor is really important. And I think, for a long time in my career, when I was younger, I was just really obsessed with knowing everything about wine and reading about wine constantly. And, it's not that I'm not anymore. I still have so much to learn, quite frankly. But I need to, and it's to my benefit, to not be so myopically focused on wine, especially when it comes to what I am, absorbing from a book perspective, from a writing perspective. So one of the best books that I've just finished in this last year that I highly recommend, although it's a little bit on the sad side, is What You Can See From Here by Mariana Leky. Really, really powerful book. I loved it. I'm currently in the middle of getting through Dear Life by Alice Munro, which is a book of short stories that my beautiful friend Alicia Summer gave to me. I've been dipping in and out of Andrew Jefford's Drinking with the Valkyries on the wine side, which I think is just he's such an incredible writer. And the wine industry is lucky that we happen to catch his focus, because I think he could honestly write about anything. So that's what I'm chewing on right now.
Great. I mean, we had Andrew on the show a couple of episodes ago, so if you haven't already had the chance to listen to that conversation, it's well worth listening to. Really interesting perspective on life as a wine writer.
Yes, I haven't yet, but I absolutely will. I mean, I have such admiration for him.
I'm back onto William Boyd and Any Human Heart. I can't remember if I've mentioned this one already on the show, but it's one that I return to periodically, probably at least once a year at the moment, just because I find it soothing, reassuring, but interesting book as well. It basically straddles the 20th century from birth to death of this character, Logan Mountstuart, as he has this ringside perspective on some of the biggest events that have taken place during that century. One that I come back to quite often. I just find it, who's the phrase we mentioned earlier this morning, quietly something.
Captivating.
Quietly captivating. There you go. Quietly captivating.
I will look that up. That sounds wonderful.
Okay. What's next for you? What can we expect? Your book is coming out in the autumn. I guess you're going to be doing some launch events and some promotion around that. But what else do we have in the pipeline?
Well, after this was finished, I promised my family I wouldn't take on any big bonkers projects for a while. So I'm going to focus on my wonderfully consuming day job, focus on my family. I keep threatening to jump back into the master wine program, so that could happen. Right now, no other big projects on the horizon. I have a fantasy about writing a book about farming and vineyards, but we'll see. Life is long. There was 9 years between my first book and this book, so I don't feel a lot of pressure to get started on something right away. I'm just gonna kind of keep my mind open and let inspiration take hold.
Great. A fourth and final reading by Kelli White from Wine Confident.
So the last chapter of this book is called Take the List, and it's a bit of a departure. Most of the rest of the book, I would say, is probably in a more of a classic introductory to wine structure. And then the very last section is a bit more of a personal appeal to encourage people to learn about wine, not necessarily for the aesthetic benefit, but to the benefit of their career path outside of wine. And or their own, financial advantage. And so I take a lot of testimonials and a lot of anonymous stories from people who have used wine as a lever in business or finance or personal relations, networking, et cetera, and paint a picture. But this is just the introduction to that section. So take the list. I hate the date dynamic wherein someone sits in polite silence while their companion makes all the decisions. This is probably because I've been on the wrong side of it for too long. Even when I'm the most knowledgeable person in the group, my gender ensures that I'm rarely handed the wine list, and let's not talk about the bill. I wish restaurants would stop making assumptions about who is taking the lead in these circumstances. Some restaurants, that is. I've had lovely experiences in many places. Handing the wine list to one person at a table reinforces the idea that wine belongs to some and not others, and constantly defaulting to the oldest, whitest male at the table sends a powerful message. This is why I'm always telling people to take the list, even if you are only just beginning to learn about wine, especially if you are not the person to whom it would normally be given. I've spent the last 100 pages or so discussing wine's aesthetic value and detailing all the ways it can improve your life, but now I'd like to make a more capitalistic appeal. A working knowledge of wine is not just good for the soul. It can offer material benefits as well. Here I'm going to tell you some stories of wine empowerment.
And where can our listeners follow you, Kelli? And more importantly, where can they purchase your books?
So I think the easiest way to, right now the book is available for pre-sale. And so that's at the Academie du Vin website. People that are interested in my Napa Valley book, there's a website called Napa Valley Then and Now. I'm pretty much only on Instagram when it comes to social media, and even then my account is private. Okay. So I look forward to disappointing everyone on there. I have really fallen off of being particularly active on social media. I am committed to trying a little bit harder this year to being more.
You're not missing anything, I can assure you.
Okay. So that's, not so active online, but hopefully, hopefully the books keep you company, and you can always come visit me at Meadowood in the Napa Valley. And that's me.
Great. Thank you so much for being my guest today on Book Club. It's been really interesting, and you've been incredibly generous with your time. So thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Some fantastic advice as well for wine novices and experts alike. Next month, my guest is Gus Zhu, and we'll be talking about his new book, Behind the Glass, the chemical and sensorial terroir of wine tasting. So I very much hope you can all join us then. Thanks once again for your company today. Until next time, ciao.
Thanks for joining the Italian Wine Podcast Book Club. Tune in again next month when we'll get between the vines with another great wine book. Remember, our show notes, including full details of all the books we've discussed today, are available at italianwinepodcast.com or wherever you get your pods.